There was, of course, much left to be done. Injured workers like Domenico Ascierno continued to be at war with the WCB because of its failure, in his eyes, to pay him the benefits he rightfully deserved. One significant item was rehabilitation and vocational training. A critical component of the Workers' Compensation Board's overall orientation to these two issues was its Downsview Hospital, which had long been viewed by injured workers as being organized and operated along the lines of a concentration camp. The treatment and rehabilitation programs injured workers received did not leave them better prepared to return to their old jobs or to take on a new one. The conclusions of an injury to one is an injury to all, a major inquiry into the workings of Downsview and the experiences of injured workers were both harsh and clear.
35% of injured workers were still unemployed after 3 years.
10% were on welfare.
13% lost homes.
Instead of restructuring the Downsview Hospital along the lines of the findings and recommendations of the report, the government chose to close it down. The ink barely had time to dry on this report when Greg Sorbara, the Minister of Labor in the new majority Liberal government, announced that he was introducing amendments to the Workers' Compensation Act. According to Sorbara, the changes he was proposing would improve rehabilitation programs and outcomes and put in place a wage loss system that would better approximate the actual wage loss of injured workers. This was the dual award system injured workers had defeated just a few years earlier. The chairman of the Workers' Compensation Board at this time was Robert Elgee. Interestingly, Elgee had been the Minister of Labor at the time of the Weiler Report. Needless to say, injured workers, their advocates, and the labor movement opposed these amendments. They asked the Minister of Labor to check the legislation and tell them where he could find the right to rehabilitation. All they could find in the bill, they stated, was a massive cutback in rehabilitation. Even more troublesome, Bill 162 was going to replace lifetime pensions with non-economic and future economic loss awards, NEL and FEL. The NEL was to cover pain and suffering. FEL payments were supposed to closely approximate the actual wage loss of injured workers. While an award recognizing pain and suffering was long overdue, injured workers and their supporters worried that such awards would be far too small. And FEL awards had what they saw was an inherent flaw. Workers' Compensation Board officials would have the power to say that injured workers could do certain jobs that came with certain wages. Two difficulties existed with deeming, as this exercise was termed. It would not matter if the injured workers disagreed that they were physically and medically ready to work at such a job, nor would it matter if such a job even existed. Injured workers could be deemed into phantom jobs with phantom wages. The frustrations of injured workers with Bill 162 came to a boil on October 17, 1988. Entering the legislature with the aim of gaining entrance to the Legislative Assembly, they were met by Ontario Provincial Police, and a shoving match ensued. Injured workers only left the building when the Ontario New Democratic Party leader, Bob Rae, promised them that he would find a solution to their problems. As 1988 turned into 1989, the protests against Bill 162 continued. No doubt because of these protests, the government did make some changes, but none were made when it came to deeming. Good news did arrive in the form of a letter from Bob Rae, who wrote to the members of the Ontario Coalition for Workers' Compensation Reform, assuring them
an NDP government would move swiftly to eliminate deeming.
To the surprise of a great many people, the NDP did become the government in 1990. To the great disappointment of injured workers, his government did not eliminate deeming. The injured workers movement had shown great determination and resilience in the fight against Bill 162. That said, activists understood it was time to start rebuilding. At a conference in 1990, activists took one step in this direction by forming the Ontario Network of Injured Workers, ONIWIG. At its founding convention, ONIWIG established its principles as being
dedicated to helping the injured and disabled and their families, past, present, and future, obtain their rights to justice, dignity, equality, health and safety, security.
Assist in organizing and educating to advance the interests of its members in the province of Ontario.
And with all the resources at its command, endeavor to establish a fair and just system of compensation.
Not long afterwards, ONIWIG and the Union of Injured Workers secured funding from the Ontario government to set up offices to help injured workers with their claims and appeals. Organizing and mobilizing picked up again. The group Bright Lights was formed so injured workers could get support and learn about the politics of workers' compensation. Conferences on topics such as re-employment were held. A sympathetic government was in power. The situation looked promising. It was a surprise then when in 1994 the NDP government introduced Bill 165, which, while giving a boost of $200 a month to the pensions of injured workers with the most severe disabilities, contained a formula, the Friedland formula, which ended the full indexing of pensions. The government justified this measure by pointing to rising costs and a worrisome increase in the unfunded liability, or the difference between the assets of the Workers' Compensation Board and the money needed to satisfy the estimated cost of all claims. Injured workers took issue with the so-called crisis of unfunded liability. In legislative hearings on the bill, Marion Endicott spoke about the monster known as unfunded liability.
Instead of addressing the real needs of injured workers, this bill has ended up fending off a mythical monster. Like any mythical monster, the unfunded liability is much talked about and worried about, but we haven't yet heard much about the nature of it and its proportions to give us some real concern. We commissioned a study on the unfunded liability. This study deals with many of the myths surrounding the unfunded liability. For example, there is an idea that the unfunded liability is a provincial debt, which will have to be paid off by the people of Ontario with their taxes. This study shows that in reality, the Workers' Compensation Act expressly prohibits such a thing from happening. There is an idea that unless the unfunded liability is paid off, the WCB will not have enough money in the future to pay benefits to injured workers. That like a private insurance company, it is essentially bankrupt. The study shows that a private insurance company would indeed be bankrupt with a similar unfunded liability. Private insurance companies must be fully funded. The WCB cannot be compared to a private insurance company. It is a monopoly which operates on a collective liability system, and as long as there is employment in Ontario, there will be premiums to pay the benefits of injured workers.
At the same hearings, John McKinnon expressed the exasperation of injured workers at the changes to vocational rehabilitation contained in the bill. According to McKinnon, the challenges of good vocational rehabilitation were not new.
Now, everyone knows that there are big problems with voc rehab at the board. If the board set up a 1-800 number to call with complaints about voc rehab, I'm sure it would take all 4,700 employees just to deal with the calls. But it's important to remember, as Phil Biggin pointed out on behalf of the Union of Injured Workers, that this is not a new problem. It's been studied in great detail. Now, Phil Biggin pointed out what Paul Weiler found. In 1981, he did a study. 39.5% of permanently disabled injured workers are unemployed. So what do you think we have now? Well, the board released the figures in a recent study. Injured workers who've been off work for more than a year and have permanent impairments, 78% unemployment.
The Bob Rae NDP government was not persuaded to change course. Bill 165 was passed into law. The building tensions and the complexities of the issues prompted the NDP government to take one further major action. In 1994, the Minister of Labour announced that Lynn Williams, recently retired international president of the United Steelworkers of America, would head a Royal Commission on Workers' Compensation. As the Royal Commission wound its way through 18 cities, including Kingston, North Bay, St. Catharines, and Thunder Bay, in each of these centres, injured workers spoke their minds. When the Conservative Party, led by Mike Harris, was elected in 1995, one of its first actions was to terminate the Royal Commission. They were also poised to make drastic changes to labour laws in Ontario. The Collective Bargaining Act was amended to exclude farm workers and domestics, and generally make it more difficult for workers to join unions. They shut down the Workers' Health and Safety Agency and cut the number of workplace inspectors by half. The labour movement mobilized against Harris's attempts to dismantle the labour relations and collective bargaining system in Ontario. Unions allied with injured workers to stop the changes to the workers' compensation system. There were some victories. Among them was the decision of the government to delay the introduction of changes to the workers' compensation law for 1 year. What the Harris Conservatives wanted to do was to change the paradigm of workers' compensation in Ontario. They wanted to move compensation as a first resort to compensation as a last resort. Prevention would be the first priority. Return to work the second. It was a win-win situation. At least that is what Elizabeth Whitmer, the Minister of Labour, proclaimed as she introduced the bill in the legislature. David Christopherson, the NDP Labour critic, was quick to challenge Whitmer's understanding of the purpose and the impact of Bill 99.
While I'm on my feet talking about you. Let's not forget that you, Minister Jackson, you've got your fingerprints all over this thing too, and you've got to wear this as much as Minister Whitmer and everybody else in that cabinet. And wear it you will. Because as far as the workers of this province are concerned, November the 26th, 1996 is a day that will go down in infamy. It's a day that this government chose to knowingly launch their legislative attack on injured workers in the province of Ontario, and I can't think of anything more despicable than an attack of that sort on the most vulnerable in our province.
The contents of Bill 99 confirmed the worst fears of injured workers and unions. Benefit levels were cut to 85%. Rehabilitation and vocational training were to be privatized. Employers would be given expanded access to injured workers' medical files. Time limits were set for claims and appeals, and return to work was going to be put on a fast track. It did not take long for injured workers to mobilize against Bill 99. How can you be bankrupt with $8 billion in the bank? Onywig President Carl Creever wondered. Injured Workers' Day in 1997 was a day of protest, as were many days after that. At one of the protest rallies, Ontario Federation of Labour President Gord Wilson demanded that the government withdraw the bill. It was repugnant and dangerous, he said, and it will cost lives. On June 16, injured workers disrupted hearings on Bill 99, keeping Labour Minister Whitmer from leaving the meeting for 2 hours. They wanted her to listen to their questions. They wanted to hear her answers. Despite the protests and widespread dissent, Bill 99 was passed and became law January 1, 1998. The law changed. The name of the law changed. What's in a name? Workers' Compensation Act conveys a sense of right and entitlement. Workplace Safety and Insurance Act emphasizes insurance, and insurance means contingency. Maybe, possibly, no. Injured workers started feeling the effects of Bill 99 soon after it became law. They were being forced back to work before they were fully healed. Labor market re-entry programs were too short, too difficult, and did not fit the needs or match the interests of injured workers. They seemed to be set up mainly to place injured workers in low-paying, low-skilled jobs so that they could be deemed. This was important for employers, as the sooner their employees were back to work, the more they would receive in rebates from the experience rating programs. An increasing number of injured workers were being forced into unemployment and poverty. They were also being stigmatized as criminals, for even as it became more and more difficult for injured workers to get in touch with their adjudicators, they were supposed to be self-reliant. It was quite easy for them to be accused of fraud via a 24/7 snitch line. Anyone could call in anonymously and report what they believed was an injured worker abusing the system. They could also be videotaped by employees of the Workers' Compensation Board's Special Investigations Unit.
The daily tasks that people need to do, going shopping, bringing home the groceries, working in the garden. People are made to feel like they're criminals if they do this activity. It's like when you're on compensation, you shouldn't do anything at all. People are worried about their neighbors phoning the snitch line, about private investigators across the street filming their every movement.
But if one day I felt okay and I wanted to shovel my lot or even cut my grass, I wouldn't want someone filming me or anything like that and thinking that I'm okay just because they saw me shovel or cut my grass one day. That doesn't mean when I go inside my home, they don't see what I'm doing in there when I'm in pain for the next few days because I've done that.
As it happened, fraud was not an issue with injured workers. Rather, employer fraud was costing the Workers' Compensation Board hundreds of millions of dollars.
The public perception has always been that we have a large amount of worker fraud. And my perception from the work that I've done in the branch is that we have fraud in every category, and that you can't say specifically that it falls within one area or that one group is responsible for the fraud and abuse that is occurring.
The Ontario government and the Compensation Board have plenty of evidence to show clearly that corporations are consistently ripping off the system for huge sums of money.
Injured workers and the injured workers movement suffered some significant setbacks throughout the 1990s. But injured workers are not people who give up. With the support of friends in the labor movement, they have organized to win both small and some large victories. Defeating the plans of the Harris government to weaken worker rights to accessible and fair hearings. In 2003, there was victory at the Supreme Court of Canada. Contrary to the desires of employers and the Workers' Compensation Board, chronic pain is compensable. Labor has also been alongside the injured workers movement in uncovering some of the abuses of the workers' compensation system, such as the experience rating programs, which have rebated nearly $2 billion to Ontario employers over the past decade, at the same time as their health and safety records have been suspect. Experience rating programs have not been shown to lead to better health and safety practices. Unions like the Canadian Auto Workers and the Canadian Union of Public Employees have also drawn up programs for workers' compensation systems that they believe will give justice and dignity to injured workers. In one way or another, they each hearken back to the 4 demands of the Union of Injured Workers and to Meritus principles. Since the early 1990s, ONIWIG and the legal clinics across the province have been at the center of educating and mobilizing injured workers. They have organized annual Christmas demonstrations intended to remind government and workers' compensation officials about the difficult situations of injured workers during what are otherwise festive times, or to state that the road towards zero accidents cannot be paved with zero benefits. Annual Injured Worker Day demonstrations have also been held on the grounds of Queen's Park to mark the moment when over 3,000 injured workers and their supporters gathered to voice their opposition to government plans to take away their lifetime pensions. Over this time, injured worker advocates have noticed how the population of injured workers is changing, from male construction and industrial workers to women and men of color from all sectors of the economy. Like all injured workers, they experience extreme difficulty in getting and staying employed. As a result, their income levels are at poverty levels. They have lost or are in danger of losing their homes. They are forced to use food banks, and they must give up their own means of transportation. They have picked up on Meritus principles, linking them to government and workers' compensation board actions both past and present. Like those women and men who have been activists in the injured workers movement for many years, they have learned that fighting back is sometimes the only way to victory. Domenico Esierno, who first appeared in the pages of Corriere Canadese in the mid-1980s, finally won his case in the new millennium. Most recently, the Workers' Compensation Board has announced a new policy on stigma, and a Bright Lights letter to the Premier of Ontario regarding the funding review has secured a promise that, as with employers, a letter will be sent out to all injured workers in the province, those on benefits and those who have received a pension of NEL, that they can make presentations to the review panel. Activism of injured workers has been their moral power. Eugene Lafrancois, a Métis, injured his back in a logging accident.
I was having trouble with the board, but I always had trouble with the board. And there happened to be in the paper, I seen the Thunder Bay and District Injured Workers Support Group was having a meeting at the library. If you have trouble with your claim, we'll talk about it. I said, oh, great. I brought my stuff. I never left them. I'm still there to this day. And being Métis, this is just another class struggle. They're like my brothers in arms, those guys. There's no difference. Money instead of land. Rights is a privilege. It's all the same thing, class struggle. You know, they all try to let the little guy down.
Another injured worker came out of her isolation through attending injured worker support group meetings.
First of all, because I've been through so much. And I believe that injured workers really need a place of support so that they're not alone. So that they don't have to go through what I went through in isolation. What I went through not knowing. I really didn't know my rights. So it was talking to these injured workers that, you know, why are each of us suffering in isolation? We should be joining together because there's so many of us.
The same story holds true for Beryl Brown, who continues to be active in the injured workers movement after attending a Bright Lights meeting on RSI.
From my experience, I would advise new activists that they should continue in the fight for justice without compromising their dignity. Never get weary despite the frustration. Never feel defeated when the battle is raging. There are always hurdles to cross, and with united effort, the groups are stronger to break down the barriers that confront them. Always remember that we are fighting as a group for the betterment of everyone and for future generations of workers.
Injured workers continue to draw their inspiration from Meredith's principles. Perhaps then, Meredith's spirit was with Orlando Buenastella in the 1994 hearings on Bill 165, when he urged the members of the committee to remember that before their workplace accidents, injured workers were very good for this province.
There's many injured workers today. Some of them are in this room, others are in other rooms. And I'm sure as politicians you have detected the emotion that's there. And that emotion signifies that they want justice. They want a law that really addresses them. And I think the message you're telling this committee is that they're not satisfied at all with Bill 165. What injured workers want is a law and a process that is not driven by faceless actuarial people, but a law that's driven by real people with a face, with a name, with a family often, with dependents, with a lot of dignity and a lot of intelligence. And these injured workers want something done good for them because they were good before they were injured for this province. They were very good. And after they got their injury, they're no longer any good. And we talk about they cost too much money. We have to find ways to reduce their monies. And we want to send you the message that you don't need, you should not, you must not cut their monies, you should not de-index their benefits, because